In the past 2 lectures, we've considered criteria that historians can apply to the surviving sources in order to discover what Jesus actually said, did, and experienced. We've seen that the oldest sources, as a rule, are to be preferred, as are sources that are not as theologically advanced and obviously biased in their presentation. Moreover, we've seen that the most reliable traditions will pass all 3 of our criteria of independent attestation, dissimilarity, and contextual credibility. In this lecture, I'd like to apply these criteria to the surviving accounts of Jesus' birth and early life, in order both to illustrate how the criteria work in practice and to set the stage for the rest of the course and its consideration of the words and deeds of the historical Jesus. To begin, we should take stock of our sources that describe this early period of Jesus' life. Neither our earliest surviving gospel, Mark, nor the last of our canonical gospels, John, provides a narrative of Jesus' birth or infancy. Both gospels do make some allusions to matters relevant to this period of Jesus' life. Both, for example, indicate that Jesus came from Nazareth, Mark chapter 1, John chapter 1, and both indicate that he had brothers, John chapter 7, Mark chapter 3. It's only Matthew and Luke, though, who have actual stories about Jesus' birth and early life. Unfortunately, the accounts in Matthew and Luke are at odds with one another on a number of points. We've seen some of these differences in a previous lecture. Were Joseph and Mary originally from Nazareth, as in the Gospel of Luke, or were they from Bethlehem, as in Matthew? Did they return to Nazareth just a month after Jesus was born, as in Luke, or did they flee to Egypt, as in Matthew, etc.? On the positive side, the differences between Matthew and Luke show beyond much doubt at all that these 2 Gospels were not dependent upon one another for their stories. In other words, if Matthew had borrowed his stories from Luke or Luke from Matthew, you would expect that they would have some of the same stories and that there'd be some basic consistency. But in fact, that isn't what you have. What that means is that the 2 accounts are independent witnesses to the birth and infancy of Jesus. They constitute independent sources of information for us. Some of the information found in Matthew and Luke can be corroborated by non-gospel accounts that are independent of them. For example, the Apostle Paul also indicates that Jesus had brothers, 1 Corinthians chapter 9, verse 5. And he also indicates that one of these brothers was named James, Galatians chapter 1, verse 19. These pieces of information corroborate what we have in the Gospels. The non-canonical infancy Gospels also cover this territory. But, as we've seen, these are not to be relied upon as preserving historically accurate information for the most part. The infancy Gospel of Thomas, for example, as we've seen, is highly legendary, and it's the earliest of these other Gospels, infancy Gospels that we have. Moreover, it ends with an account of Jesus in the temple as a 12-year-old, which is a story that this author has drawn from the Gospel of Luke. That means that the infancy Gospel of Thomas is not an independent witness. It had Luke as one of its sources. Other infancy Gospels provide us with all sorts of legendary accounts of Jesus' early life. For example, of God's miraculous protection of Joseph and Mary as they made their way to Egypt when they were escaping Herod's wrath, in stories found in a gospel known as the Gospel of Pseudo-Matthew. It's a gospel that is forged in the name of Matthew, but everybody recognized it as a forgery, and so it's called Pseudo-Matthew. It's a gospel that was written in the Middle Ages, long after the period of our interest. Contains principally legendary accounts. For the most part, then, we are restricted to the documents found within the New Testament canon, in particular Matthew and Luke. Using these sources and applying to them the criteria that we've discussed, what can we say about the birth and the early life of Jesus? I'm going to divide this discussion into two major sections. The first dealing with what we probably cannot know about Jesus' birth and early life, and the second section dealing with what we probably can know about Jesus' birth and early life. And so, first, things that we probably cannot know. There are a number of well-known traditions concerning Jesus' early life and birth, indeed some of the best-known traditions, that cannot be accepted as historically reliable when gauged by our criteria. Let me stress once again that if you choose not to apply these criteria, you have to apply some criteria to decide which traditions go back to Jesus. There are a number of traditions that don't pass these various criteria that we've discussed. I'll give you a list of several of these traditions. First, and quite importantly, we have no way of knowing whether Jesus' mother was really a virgin when she gave birth to Jesus. The tradition that she was, of course, is given by both Matthew and Luke, and to that extent it's independently attested. But it's always struck scholars as odd that the tradition of the virgin birth is not attested anywhere else in our earliest sources, even among writers who would have had a real interest in publicizing the fact that God himself was actually Jesus' father. For example, both Mark and Paul consider Jesus to have been the Son of God. And both of them, in fact, refer to Jesus having a mother. Mark chapter 3, verse 31, Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. Neither one of them, though, says anything about his mother being a virgin. This would have been quite useful information for them to point out if they wanted to buttress their idea that Jesus really was the Son of God, but they don't even mention it. In Mark's gospel, in fact, there are hints that Jesus' mother doesn't actually understand who Jesus is. In chapter 3, verse 21 of Mark's gospel, we're told that his family has come to seize him away from the public eye because they think he's gone out of his mind. Mark 2:21. That's his family. Well, who's included in his family? Well, later, chapter 3, verse 31, once again, his family comes to seize him, and we're told that to see him, and we're told that it's his mother and his brothers. It appears that in Mark's gospel, there's not only no mention of Jesus being born of a virgin, but no indication at all that Mary understands that Jesus is someone who is unique, special, as you would expect if she had had a heavenly visitant telling her that, in fact, her son was going to be born without her having engaged in an act of sex to conceive him. In the Gospel of John, we have a mention of Jesus' father, Joseph, and Joseph is actually called his father. John chapter 1, verse 45. If you didn't know Matthew and Luke, you would simply assume then that John is presupposing that Jesus was born in a normal way. Moreover, the two sources that mention the virgin birth, Matthew and Luke, both have a vested interest in the doctrine, which is quite clear from the narratives themselves. Matthew explicitly states that Jesus was born of a virgin in order to fulfill the prophecy of Isaiah chapter 7, verse 14. In other words, Matthew is using the virgin birth to show that Jesus is the prophesied Messiah. Matthew chapter 1, verse 23. For Luke, Jesus being born of a virgin shows that God really was his father. Luke chapter 1, verse 35. My point is that in neither gospel does the story pass the criterion of dissimilarity. For all of these reasons that I've been giving you, historians have long doubted whether Jesus was actually born of a virgin. At the end of the day, of course, there's simply no way to know anything at all about the sex lives of Jesus' parents. Second, it's impossible to know if Jesus was really born in Bethlehem. All four of our Gospels assume that Jesus came from Nazareth. But two of them, Matthew and Luke, again, independently claim that he was born somewhere else, Bethlehem. As we saw in an earlier lecture, though, these two are inconsistent with one another at key points of their narrative. In other words, if Matthew's account is right in how Jesus got born in Bethlehem, it's very hard to see how Luke's account could also be right, and vice versa. Moreover, both of these accounts present historical problems when taken on their own terms. For example, the idea that under Caesar Augustus there was a worldwide census that everybody had to register for, as Luke indicates. Furthermore, both of these authors would have had a clear reason for wanting to affirm that Jesus came from Bethlehem, since there was a Hebrew prophet who had predicted that the ruler of the Jews would come from there. Micah chapter 5, verse 2, which is quoted explicitly in Matthew 2:6. In other words, this again doesn't pass the criterion of dissimilarity. Again, also, it seems odd that if it were widely known that Jesus came from Bethlehem, the tradition was not mentioned in other sources, for example, Mark and John and Paul. As a result, most critical historians consider the tradition of Jesus' birth in Bethlehem to be highly problematic. Third, closely related, of course, is the story that Joseph and Mary had to travel to Bethlehem to register for a census. This tradition is found only in Luke's Gospel, so it's not multiply attested. Moreover, it seems to be contradicted by Matthew's account of how Jesus was born at Bethlehem. And third, it's not contextually credible, in that we know a good deal about the reign of Caesar Augustus, but we hear nothing at all about some kind of empire-wide tax that everyone had to go register for by returning to their ancestral home. And as we've seen, it's virtually impossible to imagine such a massive migration throughout the entire empire without anyone else in any of our sources from the period bothering to mention it. It appears then that this is not something that can be accepted as historically accurate. Fourth example, the story of the wise men who come to worship the infant Jesus is historically problematic. This story is found only in Matthew, so it's not multiply attested. It's historically implausible, both because no one else living at the time mentioned any such astral phenomenon as a star that's leading these wise men. No one else mentions any kind of astral phenomenon like this, which, if it had happened, must have attracted a good deal of attention. And it's virtually impossible to understand how the story would actually work logistically. This star leads the wise men to Jerusalem, then it stops, and they ask where the child is to be born, and then it leads them on to Bethlehem, and it stops over the house that Jesus is in. Well, how exactly does a star stop over a house? The story sounds somewhat implausible. In addition to the implausibility, though, the story appears to be used by Matthew to show that the heavens themselves proclaim this child's birth for all eyes to see. That appears to be a fulfillment of another prophecy of Scripture, Numbers chapter 24, verse 17. In other words, it doesn't pass the criterion of dissimilarity. Even more than that, the story of the wise men is used by Matthew to show that the Jewish leaders rejected Jesus. The wise men come to Jerusalem and ask where he is to be born. The Jewish leaders say, the future king is to be born in Bethlehem to fulfill Scripture. They even cite the prophecy. But then who goes to worship Jesus? Not the people who knew where he is supposed to be born, not the Jewish leaders, but these wise men who are pagans from somewhere else. The story is being used to anticipate themes that develop elsewhere in Matthew's gospel, namely that the Jewish leaders are opposed to Jesus from the get-go, and their own animosity lead to his execution, as foreshadowed by Herod sending out the troops to try and destroy the boy. In other words, this tradition of the wise men appears to be a theologically driven tradition. It does not pass dissimilarity. Fifth, we could make similar points about many of the even more problematic accounts that we've discussed, for example, from the Gospel of Luke. Luke indicates that Jesus was born when Quirinius was the governor of Syria, but he also indicates that this is when Herod was king over Palestine. Well, in fact, we know that Quirinius wasn't the governor of Syria until 10 years after Herod's death, on the basis of inscriptions and Josephus and the historian Tacitus. 6, in particular, it's nearly impossible to say whether the one New Testament story that we have about Jesus as a boy is something that actually happened. The account of Jesus as a 12-year-old in the Temple of Jerusalem occurs only in Luke. It's not independently attested. Nor does it pass the criterion of dissimilarity. This is a story that serves a clear theological agenda. Jesus is left behind in Jerusalem. He's in the temple and he's discussing matters with the Jewish teachers and impressing them with his knowledge. In other words, this is showing Jesus as a wunderkind already at the age of 12, who's completely dedicated to God and superior even at that age to the leaders of the Jews. The story doesn't pass either multiple attestation or dissimilarity, and so it's a highly doubtful story. These then are traditions that people are well apprised of because we tell these stories every year around Christmas time, but these particular stories simply can't pass our criteria. We don't know whether these stories in fact actually happened or not. There are other traditions, though, that do pass our criteria. These need to stand at the foundation of what we think about Jesus' birth and early life. I take these to be pretty rock-solid traditions about Jesus, looking at them on the basis of our criteria. First, Jesus was born and raised a Jew. That might not come as striking news to many of you. To many of my students in North Carolina, this is a striking statement. But it is quite clear from our sources, Jesus was born and raised Jewish. It's explicitly stated by Paul, as we've seen in Galatians chapter 4, verse 4. It's overwhelmingly attested in all of our gospel sources at every level. That is, it passes independent attestation in every imaginable way. There's virtually nothing more certain. Jesus was born to Jewish parents. He was taught to worship the Jewish God. He learned to read the Jewish scriptures. He was raised to follow Jewish customs, etc., etc. Jesus was Jewish. Second, Jesus came from the small village of Nazareth in Galilee. This tradition passes the criterion of independent attestation, again with flying colors. Jesus, having come from Nazareth, is attested in all four of our Gospels. Matthew chapter 4, Mark chapter 1, Luke chapter 4, John chapter 1. Jesus is sometimes actually called Jesus of Nazareth in other ancient sources. For example, Acts chapter 3. Moreover, as we've seen already just again, Matthew and Luke have had to go out of their way to explain how it was that Jesus was born in Bethlehem, since everyone knew that he came from Nazareth. See, the stories about the birth in Bethlehem are designed to show that, yes, well, even though he did come from Nazareth, he was actually born in Bethlehem. Why? Well, because that fulfilled the prophecy. The reason they had to explain it was because everybody knew he came from Nazareth. What I'm saying is, this tradition of him coming from Nazareth passes the criterion of dissimilarity. It's something the Christians wouldn't have wanted to say about him. They would have wanted to say he was, in fact, from Bethlehem, but they couldn't say that because everybody knew he came from somewhere else. Even more significantly, with respect to the criterion of dissimilarity, it's very difficult to imagine why any Christian would have made up the idea that Jesus came from Nazareth, of all places. Nazareth at that time was a small, unknown, and completely insignificant village in Galilee, which is the northern part of modern-day Israel. Nazareth is never named in the Hebrew Bible, never mentioned there. Josephus, who was the general of the troops in that part of Israel, as indicated in an earlier lecture, wrote all of these volumes dealing with the history of Israel, talking about lots of Jews doing lots of things in lots of places. He never mentions Nazareth. The first time Nazareth ever shows up in literary sources is in the New Testament, accounts of Jesus having come from there. there would have been nothing to gain for Jesus' followers to make up the tradition that he came from this place rather than someplace like Bethlehem, the home of David, or from Jerusalem, the center of power. The fact that the traditions consistently indicate that he came from this little one-horse town in the sticks shows pretty clearly that, in fact, he must have come from there. Christians show some embarrassment over that tradition. For example, in John chapter 1, verse 45, where the question is, how can anything good come out of Nazareth? Well, it's a genuine question. I mean, nobody really could understand this. They wouldn't have made up that tradition. So, in terms of certainty, so far we know that Jesus was born and raised Jewish and that he came from Nazareth. Third, we can say a few things for certain about Jesus' parents. As we've seen, they are assumed everywhere in our sources to have been Jews who lived in Nazareth. They're consistently named Joseph and Mary in our sources, independently. Matthew 1, Mark 6, Luke 2, John 1. Even the rabbinic sources, the much later sources in the Talmud, refer to Jesus' mother as Miriam, probably a variation of Mary. In none of our traditions are there any stories about Jesus' father, Joseph, after Jesus begins his public ministry. His mother shows up in some stories, but his father does not. For that reason, it's usually assumed that his father had died by the time he began to engage in his ministry. The idea, though, that Joseph was already an old man when he became betrothed to Mary is a tradition that becomes well-rooted in the 2nd century and later. The story of Joseph being an old man was typically used in order to explain why it is that Joseph and Mary never had sex. But this is not a story that has any basis at all in our earliest gospel accounts, which don't mention anything about their respective ages. About the only thing about Joseph that's found in the Gospels outside of the birth narratives is the tradition that he was a common laborer. Matthew chapter 13 indicates this, and it may be that this is independently attested in the infancy Gospel of Thomas, verse 13, that he was a laborer. The Greek word that is used by the Gospels to indicate what his profession is a Greek word that is, the Greek word is tekton. Tekton is a word that is usually translated into English as carpenter. But the word, in fact, the Greek word tekton could refer to any of a number of occupations that involve working with the hands. For example, a stonemason or a metal worker could be called a tekton. In any event, whatever it was that he did, working with his hands, the tekton was typically thought of as a lower-class, blue-collar worker, comparable in modern terms, for example, to a construction worker. This seems to pass the criterion of dissimilarity because there would have been no reason for Christians to have made up the idea that Joseph was a construction worker. I mean, they could have made up that he was a great rabbi or some other prominent profession, and so it appears that he probably was a tekton of some sort. With respect to Mary, Mary is reported in several of our earliest sources to have outlived her son. In John's Gospel, for example, she is actually present at Jesus' crucifixion. We don't have any reliable information concerning what Mary, his mother, actually thought about Jesus, since the traditions that she knew that he was the Son of God even before he was born are not multiply attested. Those traditions occur only in Luke, and they obviously don't pass the criterion of dissimilarity, because Christians would have had, you could imagine Christians wanting to invent the idea that Mary knew about Jesus all along. It is interesting that, as I've pointed out in our earliest source, Mark, there's some suggestion that Mary didn't understand who Jesus was in this passage in Mark chapter 3, where the family comes and tries to take him from the public eye because they think he's gone out of his mind. Fourth thing we can say with some certainty is that Jesus evidently had siblings of both sexes. He almost certainly, I think, had brothers. His brothers are mentioned by Mark, by John, by Josephus, and Paul, 4 independent sources. His sisters show up only in one of these sources, the Gospel of Mark, chapter 3, verse 32, and chapter 6, verse 3, it's a little hard to see why a Christian would make up the tradition that he had sisters, unless he really did, but it's not independently attested. It's sometimes been maintained by Christians that these, in fact, were not Jesus' actual brothers and sisters. The famous translator of the Latin Vulgate, Jerome, for example, claimed that these weren't his brothers and sisters, but were his cousins. Jerome could get away with claims like this because he was about the only one within his own little world who could actually speak Greek, and so he could tell people, oh yes, this is what the Greek word means. In fact, there is a Greek word for cousin that is not used of these people. The Greek word is used for as brothers. Some people have argued that these were his half-siblings from a previous marriage of Joseph, but there's no word about that in any of our early sources. The claims that they weren't really Jesus' brothers and sisters stem from the Roman Catholic doctrine that eventually developed that Mary was a virgin not only when she gave birth to Jesus, but for the rest of her life. And so the perpetual virginity of Mary, which is used to show that she was not tainted by sin, so that at the end of her life she ascended directly into heaven without having to die. There's nothing about that in any of the Gospels, however, and so the natural assumption is that Joseph and Mary engaged in sexual relations and had a large family. Jesus was presumably their oldest child. We have fifth, only scattered hints about Jesus' education. It's clear that Jesus spoke Aramaic, which is a Semitic language that's closely related to Hebrew. It's multiply attested, for example, in the Gospels that Jesus spoke Aramaic, because we have traditions in which Jesus will give a saying, and at the end of the saying there'll be an Aramaic word that the author then translates into Greek for his readers, which shows that Jesus was probably speaking Aramaic. The most famous instance of this is when Jesus is hanging on the cross in Mark's Gospel. At the very end, his last words are, "Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani?" My God, why have you forsaken me? The author gives it in Aramaic. Well, why would he put it in Aramaic if he's writing Greek? Well, because the tradition was that Jesus was speaking Aramaic. We have independently attested traditions about that. There are also indications in the Gospels that Jesus could read the Scriptures in Hebrew. For example, Luke chapter 4 and Mark chapter 12, possibly. And he's certainly known as an interpreter of the Hebrew Scriptures. He's commonly called rabbi throughout our sources. At the same time, there are independently attested traditions that the people who knew about Jesus' background were somewhat surprised by his extensive learning. This idea is not only multiply attested, it appears to pass the criterion of dissimilarity, that people were surprised at how learned he seemed to be, since obviously none of the Christians telling stories about Jesus would have wanted anyone to think that he was a slow learner as a child, and so it passes dissimilarity. Together, all of these data suggest that Jesus did learn to read as a child, that is, that he had some modicum of education, but that he was not considered to be an intellectual superstar by the people that knew him growing up. I think that's fairly certain. There are no traditions that indicate that Jesus spoke Greek, although some people think that since he lived in Galilee, where Greek was sometimes spoken, that he may well have. I think probably Jesus may have been trilingual to some extent. He spoke Aramaic, he probably could read some Hebrew, and he may have had a small smattering of Greek. We're almost completely in the dark about Jesus' early life otherwise. We might assume that Jesus had a normal childhood, but unfortunately we aren't even sure what a normal childhood would have looked like in rural Galilee. He probably would have been apprenticed to his father's line of work. That would have been a typical way to go, whether as a carpenter making yokes and gates. That's what the traditions about Joseph in the 2nd century indicate, that he made yokes and gates, not fine cabinetry. Jesus may have been apprenticed that way. He himself is called a tectone in Mark chapter 6, and it's hard imagining a Christian wanting to make up that Jesus, too, was a blue-collar worker. They would have made up something else if they wanted to make up what his career was prior to engaging in his ministry. In conclusion, we've seen how the criteria that we've discussed can be applied to traditions of Jesus' birth and early life to assist us in knowing which parts of these familiar stories are probably historical and which ones are not. We can't really say if Jesus was born of a virgin in Bethlehem, or visited by wise men, or taken to Egypt. We can say that he was born and raised as a Jew in a small village of Nazareth, that his father Joseph was a common laborer, and his mother Mary may have outlived him, and that he had both brothers and sisters. He was not a particularly precocious child, at least in the view of others in the village, but he did learn the Jewish scriptures in Hebrew, even though his native tongue was Aramaic. We're now in a position to consider matters of even greater importance for those interested in the life of Jesus, his words and deeds as an adult. Because it'll be so crucial to situate Jesus' life in its own historical context, though, we can't immediately launch into an examination without setting the stage through a careful assessment of what it would have been like for a Jewish teacher-preacher in Palestine in the first century. Our next two lectures, therefore, will be devoted to establishing the historical context of Jesus' adult life when he emerged as a public figure in Galilee and Judea sometime in the late 20s of the Common Era.